Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Avant Practice Solutions webinar series on private practice. Welcome to all of the practice owners, the doctors and future practice owners, and tonight our focus is on growing your practice. We have a fantastic group of people talking tonight, carefully curated from Avant. And we traditionally start off by recognising the traditional custodians of the land from which we're delivering these webinars. I'm sitting in Melbourne in the lands of the Kulin Nation and the Boonwurrung people here on St Kilda Road. Today we're going to hear from three of the team from Avant Law, specialist lawyers in the medical space. Stephen Schoninger, Ben Ryan and Lindsay McGregor. And we're pleased to have Kate Farley from Avant Financial Services talking about the financial side of growing a practice. This will go over an hour. There's a chance to leave questions in the question and answer tab down the bottom, and we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions. So do fire them through or call them out in that chat. So we'll start off by sort of posing the big question. And this is perhaps the question that many of you will arrive at this talk with. What is standing between you and your dream practice? What are the next steps you need to take to grow your practice? And we're going to cover it from a number of different angles. Primarily assuming that you already run a practice or have got some idea about running a practice, and have met some challenges, at least conceptually, in taking the next steps in growing the practice. Let's start thinking about optimizing practice functions. And what does a scalable practice look like? I'm giving this talk from my neurology practice in Melbourne. This started 15 years ago, now has 40 specialist neurologists working over 4 different sites, seeing well over 45,000 patients per year. And I think that it gives some sort of template about what a scaled up practice looks like. And I think important for you to think of when you're thinking about your practice is what the environment is in which you're growing. Consider the steps you're in now and what's going to make it bigger. Clearly, you need to have some ambitions. It will take some energy to grow the practice. There needs to be an addressable market. That is, you must have a clinical service you're offering that's available and is going to attract an increased market, whether it's you growing your own client base or patient base, or whether you're going to bring other doctors in to work with you. And if you do want to bring other doctors in, then you need to be clear about what your vision looks like. That is, are you going to invite doctors to work and borrow time from you in your practice, or are you going to set up a practice that they really feel part of, can potentially buy into, and they're going to contribute to the success? Of course, having doctors available to see patients or allied health people and nurses available to see patients is going to make it sustainable and profitable if it's planned in the right way. We'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Menos. You do have a vision, you want to grow the practice, you need to have infrastructure that's going to support growth. That is, that the cheapest infrastructure is usually not the best. You need to scope out an IT environment that's capable of growing outside of just you and your practice manager or your secretary. You need to have software that's available to potentially work over a couple of different sites, so potentially up in the cloud, and also security systems that sit around people that are more peripheral to you. So it might be other practitioners that are coming to work in, or in my case, 40 doctors that are working over multiple sites at any one time. We have a really important role for the IT people to look after security and continuity of service in that way. A simple server-based software may not be suitable to a scaled-up solution. So designing with that in mind. The practice management software that you choose is probably, the choice may well have been made on the basis of you running a smaller practice, but is it fit for service? Does it scale up and can it handle multiple doctors, multiple practitioners? Do you have enough licenses? And does the software, is the software going to meet your future operational needs? What do I mean by that? Well, if you've got if a single doctor and a single secretary can take bookings, no problems. If you've got 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 doctors working in the practice, you may well want online booking systems. And does your software integrate with that? Can it integrate with transcription platforms? Can it integrate with other software and accounting platforms? So asking those questions about suitability for scaling up is an important one to set the environment right for your growing practice. It's important also to plan ahead for when there's a need for more communication. So inbound communication from patients and referrers, and inbound telephone calls, emails, or faxes. What are you going to preference? My recommendation here is to not allow email conversations with patients because they take up a lot of time and they may not be safe in terms of providing care. And it's difficult to manage that when you've got many, many doctors and many, many secretaries. We might go to the next slide. When you have got more doctors and more patients around your practice, you will want to have had systems and processes that you can rely on. Now, presuming that you are the owner or the manager or the principal in the practice, what you don't want to do as you grow a practice is spend more time on managing the practice. You don't want to spend more time away from your patients just so you can have more secretaries, more doctors, more nurses in the clinic. What I would strongly recommend is that part of your planning for growing your practice would identify the strengths and weaknesses that you have in the business, the strengths and weaknesses that your personnel have, and backing that up by using some expert advice. You'll hear from some experts tonight that will provide advice, but using practice management consultants, accountants, lawyers, and financial advisors is an important way for setting the scene to understand how that you can grow in a scalable and safe way. And finally, I'd say that setting the personality of the practice is perhaps underestimated as an important point when you're thinking about growth. Is the practice going to reflect your personality? That is, how are the people, the secretaries, the administrators going to work and interact with patients? Or is there a different personality, a branding, a logo that needs to sit in front of that practice to talk to how you provide your healthcare? Now, sure, we don't learn about that at medical school, but you need to think about if you're going to sell that vision to other people, other secretaries, other employees, but importantly, other doctors that might be working at the practice as well. Let's go to the next slide. Now, what sits behind a successful business is the ability to be able to look at how you are generating money, tracking the money, and reconciling the money. In the end of the day, our accountants will tell us how much money we've earned and how much tax we need to pay. But there's a long way from seeing a patient to actually coming up with the final amount of money that has been received. And what sits in between that is the financial handling and the bookkeeping services. Now, it's all right if you're practicing by yourself with your own secretary and that you maybe don't submit a bill or you've got some inpatient billing you never get round to doing. You lose a couple of $1,000s, maybe that's no problem. And believe me, it's a common experience of doctors starting out in practice. But if you start doing that for doctors that are working, or nurses or physios that are working inside your practice and not submitting their bills and not tracking when they're paid or making sure that they're being reconciled and transferred, then you've got a real problem in your business model. So if there's one thing that I'd like you to take away from the infrastructure that you should focus on growing your practice, whether it's just for you, growing your bigger patient base, or growing for other doctors, it's really important to have a very clear compliance and governance system for financial handling. And that means being entirely transparent to the doctors that work in your practice and the other people in your practice about how you do that. Invoicing, cash handling, banking, remitting, and reporting. It is essential that you have an independent bookkeeper. Do not rely on a practice manager or a senior secretary who has not been trained in bookkeeping. They will almost certainly not keep up to date with legislation changes, compliance changes, and they probably aren't skilled in doing the amount of bookkeeping that you will be required to do to be able to encourage doctors to keep working at your practice. And it goes without saying, unless you're a payroll expert or your practice manager is a payroll expert, that should be an outsourced capability so that you aren't subject to fraud from staff paying themselves and that you're compliant with the requirements. One of the things I frequently hear from doctors starting practice is they have no plan to provide pay slips for their staff. it is a legislated requirement as an employer to provide a compliant pay slip every single pay cycle. So rather than get caught up with that, outsource your payroll as well. Minos, we might go to the next slide, which really just takes us to thinking about how we're going to build a team that can help scale up your practice. Now, we'll be joined in a moment from Stephen to hear about the legal side of things, but I want to take you through a modern view of how to scale up without necessarily having to pay for another full-time person. Let's have the next slide, Minos. When you are growing a practice, you're going to create more work for you, more work for your administration team. The key here is to make sure your administration team stays ahead of the curve so that you're not doing more work and not doing revenue generating activities like seeing patients or doing surgery. So more work requires more admin resources, and you need to staff up to maintain the level of service for yourself, your patients, and other doctors that might be working in the practice. Now, what you should be doing, and if you're taking notes, it's important to write down here, that you want to be able to set up a system so that you can manage a team, which means practice management is an important part, not just a role that someone fills, it's actually actively managing your staff resources so you can look after the business and look after the staff, look after the patients and the other doctors. What that means is that you need to have input and excellence and experience, I should say, inside the practice about strategy. You need to have an idea about HR skills, what a good financial report looks like. You need to have a bit of business planning, and you need to have, as I mentioned, bookkeeping and payroll. Now, if your practice manager isn't trained in this and you haven't been trained on these different things, then there is a need and a requirement for you to be able to bring that in-house. Next page, thanks. So the old model of one doctor and one secretary doesn't work if you want to scale up, because most secretaries need annual leave, lunch breaks, and occasionally they're sick as well. That's multiplied if you've got more doctors or more patients coming into the practice. It's quite possible in the modern world to use an outsourced service to provide some administration backup. So rather than employing more and more full-time equivalents or part-time people you have to manage, it's possible to have, for example, telephones answered from an organisation like Avant Practice Solutions, where you can plug in a small team that will sit behind your front desk secretaries as you're scaling up. It's a really efficient way of having some of the work done and paying on a per-use basis, rather than going out and employing more and more and more staff that may well create more hassles. And that's an easy way to scale up until you get to the size you want, and then you employ more people. Next slide, thanks. There's other expertise that you will know already that you need to outsource. Presumably most people on this call will outsource to an accountant. Most of us should outsource to an IT person, and that's really important to have a medical expert in IT to make sure the right governance structures around your IT system. You're going to hear from the lawyers who you should outsource your expertise to, and it's important again to have lawyers who are experienced in medical businesses so that you know how they should be set up. A finance broker who understands medicine and medical practice, and a practice management consultant on top of the list, because a practice management consultant can fill the capability and capacity gaps of the person you employ, or they can act instead of employing someone as a practice manager and all you employ as a secretary or group of secretaries. They also help with business planning because they will have done that before. So these are some ideas about expertise that you should be considering for taking the next step in your practice. Next page, thanks, Minos. Stephen, over to you to take us through some of the rules about employing people.
Thank you, David, and hi, everybody. So we are very heavily regulated in Australia when it comes to the labour market, but there are multiple different options for you when it's time to be scaling up your business and bringing in new staff members. The most classic types of engagement are employment, contracting, independent contractors, and outsourcing, as David has already touched on, is a great way of particularly in the early days, testing the waters in your growth phase as to where you want to be going. In terms of employment, our employment laws are complicated and heavily regulated, so it is really important to get good advice early on. Get yourself some good foundational employment contracts that are complying with our minimum terms and conditions of employment. Employees can be full-time or part-time or casual. Full-time employment is a person working 38 hours per week plus reasonable additional hours. A part-time employee works less than 38 hours per week, a set number of hours and days each week. That's permanent part-time employment is what that's also known as. A casual employee, in contrast, is working on a really ad hoc basis. They don't usually have regular days or hours. They are on call for you to fill peaks and troughs in labour. Somebody's sick, a particular busy day is coming up. A true casual employee is somebody who you have employed in the background, who you call on as the needs of the business dictate, and who may or may not be available based on whatever else they are doing. If you are really looking for somebody to be with you on set days and hours at a particular time of the day or time of the week, it's more likely that you probably really need a part-time employee, and that's something you should be getting advice on. When it comes to casual employment, there are laws in Australia that allow casual employees who've been with a business for at least a year, who have worked relatively regular hours in practice over at least the previous 6 months of their employment, to convert to part-time employment by asking their employer, saying, hey, I've worked these regular hours, I think I'd like to become a part-time employee or a full-time employee. Can you accommodate this? And you need to be considering those conversion requests or proactively looking at it if you are a large employer, which is an employer with 15 or more employees. But if you're in the early days, a small business with less than 15 employees, your casual employees may come to you and request casual conversion. You don't have to grant casual conversion, but you need to seriously look at it and looking at it, be considering various factors that are laid out in legislation as to whether or not you can reasonably accommodate that conversion to part-time employment. And what you'll find in practice is that where the person has been working quite regularly, there's really little reason why you wouldn't want to convert them to part-time. But if there are changes coming up in the business, for example, then you'll have a legitimate reason to say, look, no, we can't make that commitment at this particular time. Always get advice about the casual conversion piece if you're in doubt. In terms of other types of employment, fixed term employment is also possible, which is where a person is employed for a particular period of time, whatever that might be, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. There are relatively new laws in Australia that prohibit fixed term employment for more than 2 years or more than 2 contracts in a shorter period of time. So you can't have fixed term employment for 3 years, 5 years, whatever the case might be. The reason for that is based around security of employment and the desire for most employees and as many employees as possible to have the security of permanent ongoing employment. Employment is still terminable by giving notice under the contract. And so ongoing employment is not something to be scared of as a business owner. It is something to be managed in accordance with our legal landscapes. So for employment, when you're looking at staff like nurses, administrative staff, secretaries, very often, and most often, they will be employees. It would be very unusual that a non-skilled individual would be engaged as an independent contractor. And when I say skilled, I mean very highly skilled and specialised. Most nurses and administrative staff, they are employed in roles that are covered by awards. Awards are instruments that set minimum terms of employment, and so those positions need to be covered by the employment landscape. When it comes to looking at scaling up doctor-wise in terms of expanding the numbers of doctors at your practice or adding allied health professionals, physios, whatever the case might be, it is very common. It's less common for them to be employed. It is possible and completely lawful to employ a doctor or to employ a physiotherapist, but in practice, most doctors and allied health professionals these days operating independent businesses, and so they will be an independent contractor, or they might engage your practice to provide them with services and facilities. An independent contractor is a person who sells their specialist labour to you for a fee and works on behalf of your business. So in the medical context, an independent contractor would be a doctor who comes in to provide the particular specialty area of expertise for the patients of your practice. The flip side of an independent contractor, the opposite of an independent contractor almost, is a service and facility arrangement, which is where, as opposed to the doctor providing services to your practice is providing services and facilities to the doctor to enable that doctor to operate their own independent medical business. Ben is going to talk more about these types of arrangements later on. These are the types of arrangements that have received a lot of focus in the last 18 months or so from a payroll tax perspective. The majority of private sector doctors in Australia today work under services and facility agreements, meaning that they are going to medical practices for those practices to provide them with the services and facilities for them to run their own independent business in return for a fee. Outsourcing, as we mentioned, is a really great way of, particularly in the early days, quickly getting additional labour that you need, where you're not quite sure if you're ready to take the plunge to employ an extra secretary, an extra nurse, whatever the case might be. And so outsourcing is where you go to a labour hire provider or another company that is providing labour solutions for your business. And so, for example, Avant Practice Solutions, as David mentioned, where there are various options available. We need to be very careful in looking at our employment arrangements or our working arrangements generally. Again, based on from the compliance point of view, it is unlawful to engage in sham contracting in Australia. Sham contracting is where a business knowingly misrepresents employment as an independent contractor relationship. So it would be unlawful to tell an administrative employee that they need to go out and set up their own company and get their own ABN or something and things like that, because you're going to be contracting with them as an independent contractor, when the reality is, at law, that person will be an employee of your business. Can we have the next slide? Thanks, Manos. Thank you. So in terms of some fundamental important points from the workplace law point of view, regardless of what type of worker you have, whether you're employing staff on a full-time, part-time or casual basis, on a fixed-term basis, or you're engaging an independent contractor, or you've decided to provide services and facilities to independent doctors, it's really important to have a current written contract for each of those types of workers. In the absence of a written contract that is relevant to the current relationship, the law will imply various terms into the contract that you may not want to be there. And so having that written contract lets everybody know where they stand. Very importantly, how much money they are getting paid, or how much fees you are collecting at your end. If you're on a service agreement model, it will include provisions around termination of the arrangement and so forth. So it's really desirable to have a current written contract for all workers. From a workplace point of view as well, regardless of the type of worker, you are the controller of the particular workplace. You are the controller of your practice. And so you have responsibilities under laws dealing with equal opportunity, discrimination, bullying, harassment, to make sure that appropriate standards of behaviour are being exercised and maintained by all workplace participants, regardless of whether they're an employee or a contractor or an independent doctor. And so it's essential to have an appropriate workplace behaviour policy. That is a policy that's dealing with the laws and obligations of all workers around discrimination, sexual harassment, bullying and victimisation. And there needs to be a related complaints procedure so that people know what to do, who to talk to if concerns are being raised in any of those areas. You will be liable at law for the conduct of your employees in relation to work if there is any inappropriate behaviour going on. And so, and you'll have broader obligations under these laws and the related work health and safety laws to provide a safe place of work. And so to be ensuring across the board that there are no unlawful behaviours going on. Sexual harassment and bullying are very, very common in Australian workplaces of all kinds, and they create a lot of legal risk, with significant damages being awarded in Australia for claims in those areas. There are also various particular laws, especially for those of you in New South Wales and the ACT. Workplace surveillance legislation is really important to be complying with. So to the extent that you are providing computer networks and internet access and so forth for staff, and you would like to monitor what is being done to protect confidential information, patient confidential information, and so forth, there are mandatory compliance rules in relation to the laws around notifying employees about that and workers about that surveillance that's going on. Generally speaking, it's desirable to avoid any prescriptive policies dealing with performance management, discipline, or termination of employment. The reason that that's desirable is that from a legal point of view, I want you to have maximum flexibility to control your workplace and to make decisions based on the needs of the workplace, going back to those cultural sort of considerations that David mentioned earlier on. So if you put in place prescriptive policies about the way you will do these certain things, in certain circumstances, they can be found to be binding upon you contractually, so that if you don't follow those policies, the worker may have a claim against you for damages for breach of contract. So we want to avoid that as much as possible and give you maximum flexibility. So avoid the temptation to get caught up in those sorts of policies that say how you will or won't do things if inappropriate behaviours are going on. And finally, I just wanted to reiterate the sham contracting point, which is a very important one. So if you're in doubt about the proper characterisation of the workers that you intend to engage, do get advice early. Quite often we can have a really quick conversation about what your plans are and quickly identify that, no, those are going to be employees. Let's focus on the minimum entitlements, make sure you're getting it right, and be able to move forward from a really great compliance perspective. That's it for me. I'll hand back to David and Ben.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Really appreciate that. So now to the more challenging part, I suppose, or at least one of the more challenging parts of actually growing the practice. And one thing that we know a lot of people really struggle with is how to actually incentivize people to join your practice. Certainly, if I were to start a practice called Ben Ryan Lawyers, that's not going to be as appealing for people to join as Avant Law. Also because there's not that ability for people to necessarily buy into the brand and have that general awareness. So really have a bit of a think about when you are even starting out your practice or reviewing your practice, what are you actually building? Are you building a professional reputation, or are you wanting to build a brand that people can actually buy into, that you can then leverage across multiple sites, multiple locations, and have people potentially buy into, or at the very least happily work under, with you and for you? Certainly part of the aspect when you are thinking about that, and I'll touch on it in a couple of slides as well, is thinking about your sort of other social media aspects and your branding aspects. A lot of the time we'll talk to people and they'll say, I've got the best name for my new practice. It's going to be great. I've already got the marketing team doing up all of the logos and everything else. And we'll then say to them, well, have you checked the social media pages? Have you checked business names? Have you checked trademarks to see if those names are still available? You'd be surprised at how many people call themselves insert location, insert specialty. It's fairly common, and it's a bit difficult to set yourself apart from others when you're not really establishing a brand that other people can buy into. Nothing wrong, of course, with necessarily working with other people or working for other people. There's a lot of practitioners that we will talk to on a regular basis. Some are very happy to own their own practice and to run the whole thing by themselves. Others want to have that collegiate aspect of having buy-in with other people, so that everyone is invested in the business and everyone has a say in terms of what is actually going to be happening on a day-to-day basis. I think one thing that people struggle with is that relationship tester. We love for people to go into business with colleagues or with friends that they've gone through uni with and specialization with, and they go, let's just work together. We get on really well, fantastic. Unfortunately, we have to come in and do the relationship stress test and effectively say, well, whilst you may get on really well, do you actually agree in how you're going to operationally run the business? What decisions are going to be made, how they're going to be made, and potentially what's the future of the business? If you can't agree on those sort of things at the very outset, then you want to make sure you're thinking about, well, maybe it's a case of rather than working with other people, we have other people working for us so that we can focus on the operational matters, or at the very least not have to compete with other personalities within the business. One challenge that a lot of practices face, as I say, and I think probably one of the main challenges that practices face, is how to actually get other people to not only work in the practice but to refer to you, particularly on a basis of you will have a brand and you will have a persona that is publicly available. And if you struggle with attracting staff or other patients, then you definitely will struggle in practice. So you need to think about that end-to-end experience of not only how patients are going to perceive the practice and the work that you do, but how referrers and how the other people working in the practice with you are going to perceive the services that you're offering. Of course, it's all well and good to have a practice and to be your own boss. And everyone loves to throw out those growth figures of we might be turning over $300,000 this year, but in 2 years' time we want to be a $6 million revenue business year on year. That sounds great on paper, but how are you actually going to get from point A to point B? It would be lovely if you could just write it down and it would magically happen for you, but that's not a reality for a lot of people. Certainly and shockingly, I'm sure it'll surprise you all that Avant Practice Solutions does have that practice management consultant aspect available for you to help workshop those processes with you and maybe come up with those plans with you of just how to grow the business and to create those business plans, not only for your own benefit. Certainly business plans help the owners of the business, but potentially even sharing those plans to a certain extent with the team of the doctors or the staff that are working with you, so that they can all buy in and see where you're trying to get the business, and they can understand, well, okay, yes, I'm working hard, but we're trying to get to this point, and this is what the benefits are potentially going to be for me as we progress the business along that way. Of course, the value proposition is always one of those points that people often overlook. It would be fantastic if you could just say, well, I got into medicine because I wanted to help people. But at the end of the day, you need people to actually provide that treatment too. And so what are you doing differently to other practices out there? There's a lot of health practitioners in Australia, a lot of other specialists that you'd be competing with on a day-to-day basis, or at the very least having very similar service offerings too. So have a bit of a think about, why would someone come to your practice over another practice? Are you a market leader in terms of the way that you're providing your specific surgeries or your practice? Is your practice, you spend a fortune on your fit out and it just is a nice place for people to sit and very relaxing, so that when they come through the door, they don't have to stress about these things. Have a think, take that step back, think about what you're offering, why your staff want to be there, and how come your staff may potentially sell your service to other practitioners that they talk to in terms of being your advocates to get people to join your practice. I think it's a common misconception of people potentially saying, well, I'm my own business and I've got to do all of the recruiting and everything else myself. Certainly, if you have a practice team around you that love the place that they work and that see the value in what they're doing, they'll often become your best advocates for you and help not only drive referrals, but also potentially other relationships with other practitioners. As I mentioned before, it's all well and good to have the business and the business name, but certainly if you're wanting to have that value proposition and have the ability for people to buy into your business, do think about potentially trademarking your brand. As I mentioned before, Avant Law is not specific to the location. Yes, it is specific to the fact that we're a law firm, but we're able to have the Avant brand that applies not only to Practice Solutions, but to us, also to the financial team, as well as all these other aspects, so that it's a big umbrella that all these different divisions can work under nationally. Same for your practice. If you're wanting to have that growth mindset of, I'm going to start out here, but then we're going to open multiple locations and multiple sites, similar to what David's done personally. It will help having a brand that isn't tied to a specific location, so that people can potentially recognize your brand and go, I know that place, I've heard of it before, I know what I need to do, and I can potentially buy into that brand. That's a very powerful opportunity for not very much cost. Copyright, please don't ever try and buy or register copyright. If you do, you're probably giving $50 or $100 away to some happy little scammers. In terms of domain names and licensing for your branding, do think about registering before you even go public with your brand. All of the possible hashtags and links and various other things on social media. Get all of the website domains of .com, .com.au, etc., to try and make sure that no one's potentially going to register a competing brand. Be surprised at how often we have conversations with people who've registered .com.au but haven't registered .com or .org or various other aspects. So do make sure you take as many up as possible. Also think about privacy. It's one of those common issues that often get overlooked as a practice does grow, but make sure you're complying with all of your Australian privacy requirements. It is a heavily regulated area, and there's a lot of onus, particularly on the health industry, to make sure that you are protecting patient records and patient information. When you are looking at your social media, Stephen touched on it before, it's incredibly important that the way you're portraying the relationship between the doctors and the practice is as clear as you possibly can. We've seen, certainly from payroll tax, increase in revenue officers looking at your websites, looking at your LinkedIn pages, your Facebook pages. And if you're presenting publicly a relationship where the doctors are being engaged by your practice to provide services to your community on behalf of the practice, and your service agreements say that you're actually the service provider and you're providing the services to the doctors who provide the treatment to their patients, you have a conflict between what the written agreement is and how you're portraying yourself to the public. So please do make sure you take that time to just think, okay, are we engaging the doctors or are they engaging us? And so we need to now make sure that the way we're portraying ourselves to the public is clear and is accurate. When you are looking at those growth mindsets and even planning for when you want to retire, I don't know many practitioners who go into private practice on the basis of I want to work until the day I die. Usually it's a case of I want to work, I want to build up as much asset and as much wealth as I possibly can. Certainly talking with Kate and the AFS team is going to help you get that lending to do all of the growth and to buy all those assets. But if you don't start thinking about how you're hopefully, or when you're hopefully going to retire at the outset, the next best time is right now, because it does take several years to actually get the most value from your business. So please do take the time to think about how you're going to incentivize people to join, how you're going to potentially grow the practice, and what your exit plan looks like. Are you going to sell to people that are within the group? If so, how do you keep people in the group to stay and to buy in? Or are you going to look to potentially sell to a third party or a corporate? Because that might be different aspects that you need to consider as part of the practice and as part of how you're operating for a few years. Of course, one of the main challenges is how do you retain and incentivize? We've covered it off a few times now, but think as well about potentially some alternate methods of charging a service fee to the practitioners who engage your practice. There's an example up there, but there's so many different ways potentially looking at an hourly rate rather than the traditional service percentage. Also have a think about whether you're trying to grow the practice, potentially offering incentives, shares to people that are looking to join. If you have a doctor that's looking to join your practice and you're trying to incentivize them, or they're working really hard and you want to try and keep them, think about having a share dividend policy, assigning them a special class share that just entitles them to a discretionary dividend. They essentially get a bonus year on year, subject to how well the practice is operating, but they're incentivized to stay because of that bonus scheme. And it also then has the benefit of you test out the relationship when they have a little bit of buy-in into the practice so that you can make sure the relationship is as strong as possible with them. That's the very quick, rushed sort of some considerations for you all to think about, because it is such a complex matter and a complex issue. But you won't be able to grow the practice or even start a practice and think about that succession planning without having some money to do so, and certainly without thinking about some of those property considerations that are always a challenge. So with that, I'll hand over to Lindsay and Kate to tell you a bit more about that.
Thanks, Ben. Certainly a lot to think about there. For anyone I haven't worked with, I'm the head of property at Avant Law. So today I'd like to just run through some of the things that you might want to think about when you're looking at your property needs for your expanding practice. So one thing to keep in mind is that property decisions can be permanent decisions. So they're going to be with you for a long time. And the first thing that you'll probably consider when you're looking at buying or when you're looking at taking a property is whether you're going to buy that property or whether you're going to lease that property. It's really a personal decision for you. I'll focus more on buying a property here because I think it's a better long-term prospect for your expanding business. Leasing can be good because you can move around and you can certainly take leases of different premises across the country or across the state. But in leasing, you're not really guaranteed that long-term tenure. And as an owner of the property, you're someone that actually controls the land. So you've got a lot more security around that. The first thing that you would normally consider when you're looking at starting or expanding a practice is really what's your location. You have to think about things like what's the zoning in that area? Who are your neighbours? Are the council going to let you use the land for what you want to use it for? Are your neighbours going to be complementary to your use? The other thing to think about is, again, expanding your practice. Is there an opportunity to expand there? So if you're leasing a property, can you take the property next door? If you're buying, is there other properties you can buy next door to expand into? There's a lot to consider. If you're leasing property, for example, you will need to get the owner's agreement if you want to knock walls down between properties. If you're buying a property, you obviously don't need to go through that, but perhaps you're buying in strata, you might need to get body corporate approval for things like that. Other things to think about just with location is street traffic. Who's walking past? How busy is the area? The other thing is parking. Parking is really quite big for both doctors and patients. Your doctors that you might employ or who might come and work with you, they're going to want some parking as well. But your patients are definitely going to want parking as well. And you might need to think about whether or not there's ambulance bays that you need to put in and whether or not you need to be close to other medical support. So do you need to be close to a hospital? Do you need to be close to some other allied health professional? The next thing with buying a property is what entity are you going to buy it in? Are you going to set it up in your self-managed super fund? If you are, that's something that we can definitely help with as well. So some people might buy the property within their self-managed super fund and you can borrow money to do that. And then you lease it back to the business that operates the practice. Something you would need to talk to your accountant as well, but it's something that you should definitely talk to us very early in the stage if you're looking at doing that. And remembering as well, if you are setting up a practice in a self-managed super fund, you'll lease it back to your operating entity, but that's something that you have to be very careful when you do, because you have to make sure that you're paying a market rent and you need to make sure that you're complying with your ATO requirements, which are things like making sure you've got regular valuations of the property. I think it's every 3 years you have to get the actual property valued. So it's something that you need to talk to us and your accountant with. Definitely something you need to get us involved with before you've even looked at a property if you're looking at buying it, because we need to set up some trust documents and things before you get started, and certainly get the contract in the correct name, because it's very difficult to change a contract for sale after you've signed it. Some of the other things with property that you need to think about are the ongoing costs. So if you were, for example, renting the property, you're going to have rent, you're going to have outgoings and things like that. Rent can be quite difficult to control. And again, that's why I prefer to buy a property instead of leasing one. The typical example that comes up in my practice is someone has not necessarily exercised the option in time, and then they're held to ransom by the landlord, who knows that they need to stay in the premises, and so they try and charge them a bit more for the privilege of doing that. Even if you do exercise the option on time, there's market review would normally happen, and that's outside your control. It's basically whatever the market determines that the rent for the property should be. So that is quite difficult to control. So again, going back to renting or buying, you might be better off actually renting the property. You might be better off buying the property because you can actually control what those rents are. The other unknown cost, as I mentioned with leasing, is the outgoings. So you don't have control over what those outgoings are, and your landlord will pass on costs for things like landscaping, management expenses, all those sorts of things. And without us looking at the lease very carefully in the beginning, that's something that's often quite hard to control. The other thing, if you are leasing, the most common complaint that I see in my practice is someone who is trying to run their practice, but the air conditioning doesn't work. So the landlord will obviously control the air conditioning. If it's a big building, it'll be a back to base central system. So it's quite difficult to make the landlord service your premises in particular. You have to be very careful with the drafting in the lease and make sure that the landlord is actually obliged to do that. Whereas if you buy the property, you've got control over that and you can install additional air conditioning units and whatnot as you need. If you're moving premises to expand your practice, one of the big things that you need to think about is a competitor going to backfill your space? So how are you going to leave your old premises? Are you going to leave them with a fit out in place that someone can easily just jump into, or are you going to return them back to what we call a base state condition, which is where you strip everything back to bare concrete on the floor and just walls and ceiling tiles? In my view, that's the better thing to do because it's very easy for someone to jump into a premises, take over your fit out, and then essentially your patients might not even know that you've moved. It's quite a difficult thing to let everyone know that you've gone. So in my view, it's best to move, let everyone know, and get rid of those old premises completely and strip all your branding, strip all of your fit out of there. So I guess my key message there is that whatever you're going to do, if you're looking at buying a property or you're looking at renting a property, get us involved really early. Think about the planning, think about your strategy for growth. What are your long-term goals? Can you get us involved? Let us review the contracts. Let us review any heads of agreement for a lease at the beginning so that we can really get in there and protect you. Because remember, if you're leasing, this document's going to be around for 5, 10, 15 years. You don't want to be stuck with a lemon for that whole time. If you're buying a property, you want to make sure that you're buying something that's good for the future and it's not something that is going to cause you any headaches down the track. If we can jump to the next slide there, Menos. So the next thing there is really once you've got the property, so you've bought the property or you've leased the property and you're about to move in, what do you have to do to move in? So the first thing that you're likely to do is some renovations to the property and make sure that they're fit for your purpose. When you're doing that, you have to think about what sort of council consents you need and what sort of other consents from authorities you might need. You need to check the zoning and make sure that the property can be used for that particular use. Again, if you're buying a property, it's a lot easier because you don't have to get landlord consent to any of the changes that you need to make. But if you are leasing, there's likely going to be a clause in your lease that requires you to give plans and get approval and landlord consent for all of those things that you want to do. Again, if you're in a strata or a body corporate type property, then you're going to have to get strata consent for some of those things. Again, get us involved in the beginning because we can check your lease or we can check all that zoning and we can help walk you through that. As I said before, services, the biggest complaint I get is that the air conditioning is not functioning or there's some issue with the building. They're really important things to consider. So make sure when you're fitting out your property that you've got sufficient electrical data points and all those sorts of things through the property so that your practice will work as smoothly as possible. You might need to have supplementary air conditioning because you might have equipment that lets off more heat than a normal standard empty room. So you need to think about all those things in advance. If you're fitting out a property and installing different rooms, then you need to make sure you consider your fire safety requirements. So you'll need to make sure there's smoke detectors and fire suppressants in each of those rooms. So you need to think all that through in the beginning. Think about things like, is your power supply guaranteed? Are your fridges going to go out? These are all the things that we need to check in the document first. Traditionally, again, with leasing, your landlord has the upper hand. So the lease that you get is going to be very much drafted in favour of them, and it's going to have indemnities and releases and all those things in favour of the landlord. So it's very difficult if we don't look at that in the beginning to then challenge it down the track. Think as well about some of the technical limitations on the property. So if you're going to be bringing in big, heavy equipment, will it fit in? Is your floor strong enough to support all of that sort of stuff? If you're financing the equipment, which Kate might talk about soon, often your lease will prohibit that. So it's something we need to, again, think about in the beginning, because we might need to get your landlord's consent to do that. The landlord might want to register personal property security over items of equipment that they might have financed as part of an incentive, or just generally in relation to the property. But all of this is the tip of the iceberg. It's something that you really need to get us involved with from the very beginning. As I said, if you're setting up trusts or self-managed super funds, get in contact with us really early so that we can think about all that and get you in touch with the right people, get the right documents in place before you sign the contract or before you sign the lease. We can help with any kind of due diligence that you do on the property, even if it's just checking heads of agreement for a lease, or if you're buying the property, we can do all of the searches that you need us to do. We can report on the property and really fill you in on everything you need to know about it. And then on that, I'll pass over to Kate, who can help tell you how to buy the property.
Thank you, Lindsay. I did joke before we started this webinar, I've got a bunch of lawyers before me, so I may not have much time to go through everything, but I'll try and do what I can to touch on some of the topics. But some of the very generous speakers beforehand have already mentioned some of these, so I should be able to gloss over some of them in less detail. But just as a formal introduction, my name's Kate. I'm actually a relationship director with Avant Financial Services, which was formerly Kuyong Group, and we're a part of Avant Mutual. We effectively provide finance broking services for doctors and anyone who has had to apply for a loan and has gone through the whole process of explaining what their income entails in the medical industry. It is definitely a niche area. So if you know who to go through, or go through the specific areas or parts of the bank that have medical offerings, then it does make things a lot easier. So touching on growing your private practice, these are the things that could potentially require some capital or some funding that you might need in order to increase your practice operations. So in the event that you're not able to outsource staff, like what was touched on earlier, hiring of new staff, that's one area that does require some funding. It could just be the hiring process, the legal side of things with documentation, getting a recruitment agent involved, but it also could just be the case of, if it's a direct employee, there's a cost of paying them and training them before they actually start breaking even and covering their own additional costs. So that is something that you have to budget for in your cash flow. Upgrading or purchasing of additional equipment. So I often see this with practices where they might start out with some equipment, but as you get more patients and you expand some of the service offerings, more equipment is required. Or it could have been that you bought an existing practice that had some older equipment that needed upgrading. So this is something which is kind of the bread and butter, especially around tax time, which will be coming up. Funding that is a pretty straightforward process. Another option is relocation of your premises. This has been touched on quite substantially throughout this webinar so far, but that's obviously the highest cost side of things, because if you're already established, you're having to start from scratch, or if you're not established at all and you are starting again, it's referred to as a greenfield. So it is quite extensive, the information that you have to put together in planning of that expansion of your existing premises. So this could be in a number of ways. So it could be upgrading the existing fit out. So what we do find now that with technology, sometimes you can go into an existing practice, it's been operating for 20, 30 years, and the floor plan is not really functional. It's not making the most of what's already there. So sometimes clients will actually just redesign the existing floor plan just to get a few extra rooms out of it. So it might actually work better for them. So I made the mistake. So I've kind of touched on this already. So the revenue uplift might not catch up with the staff, the additional capital that is available. So the easiest option for this, if you haven't got enough funds available to cover the expected capital outlay with hiring new staff, is usually an overdraft. So it's a good way to have as working capital. It's not the cheapest way to fund because it's an overdraft. They usually do charge a slightly higher rate, but you are only being charged on what you use. So we use this more as a safety net for clients. You don't really want to have to use it, but it's good to have it there if, like, you're expanding and you're expecting the first 6 months to be a bit iffy, and if things don't go 100% to plan, there is a chance that you might need it. It's better to worry about the interest you're going to pay as opposed to, can I actually pay what I need to pay? So that's one way to look at it. Equipment. So often what will happen is, depending on the type of modality that you are, there's different lending thresholds that you can almost automatically get approved for, subject to just a clear credit check and just making sure that your assets and liabilities aren't really a red flag for anything. So what will happen is, if at certain points in your life there's an expectation of what kind of assets you might have behind you, so occasionally we might have to go into more detail, but in terms of this, it's a quick turnaround regardless. Even if you have to go into more detail, it's usually anywhere from a couple of days to a week, if it's within those thresholds. If it's outside of that, then it might be just something that you'd have to provide a bit more information on and actually have an assessment done. Purchasing the practice location. So as Lindsay touched on, with the way leases are going, it's sometimes you actually do the sums. The cost of actually owning the location versus having a lease are pretty comparable. So for a lot of clients, it's pretty lucrative to actually go into a practice themselves and purchase. The only challenge is, in this environment, can you find something? That's really the biggest hindrance in terms of whether or not you can purchase one, because a lot of the medical lenders, if you're planning to operate from that location, will lend up to 100% of the practice purchase price, and then you've got the fit out cost on top of that you would have. SMSF is pretty lucrative in this space because there's not that restriction on you being able to use your own premises the way there is with a residential super fund investment. So with commercial, you can actually be your own tenant, and it's a way of kind of shoring up your premises without actually reducing your borrowing capacity in a personal capacity, because super is isolated. So it's a way of building your asset position up without limiting other growth opportunities to purchase, whether it's a home or other investments that are around. So the renovation or fit out loan, that's usually done through the service entity that is ultimately the tenant. The reason for this is just you can kind of offset it against the cash flow that you receive from service fees for any consultants that might come in, any other specialists that are in your practice, or even the service fee that you pay. Ultimately, that will be used to pay any lending for the fit out and potential any lease payments as well. Now, in order to do the renovation or fit out, there is an expectation that that would interrupt your day-to-day working, and therefore a business plan or cash flow forecast may be required. So the business plan was touched on earlier with Lindsay and with Avant Practice Solutions. If you aren't 100% sure what you're wanting to do and how to articulate that, then they can assist in doing that. Often I'll work with accountants in this fashion as well. It's just a bit of background about yourself, what you're looking to do. If you're looking to get any allied professions in there to assist you with building up your practice, it's just touching on what you're doing and the why, and why it's going to be successful. And if there are any risks that you have, for instance, what Lindsay touched on previously as your previous premises, how you mitigate that, whether or not where you've come from potentially might impact where you're planning to go. So the cash flow forecast is also very key. The amount of times I've seen in my career a straight line cash flow forecast that doesn't reflect that there's seasonality to income. Banks hate that. If you want to get a loan declined, it's a really easy way to get a flag where they start looking at everything else more skeptically because it looks like no effort's been put in. So that's something where if your current income today is not sufficient to support the lending that you're asking for longer term, then we need to show that there's been some consideration in what your plans are. Pretty sure it was Ben who said failure to plan is planning to fail. That's kind of what the banks view it as well. If you can't articulate it in a document like a business plan or a cash flow forecast, it can actually impact what your borrowing capacity would be. So refinancing, if you're planning to grow, what I'll often see is clients that they got their lending completed maybe 5-10 years ago. As they were starting out, the banks were a bit skeptical about what they're wanting to do. So give me the home, give me personal guarantees, give me everything before we'll give you any money. And now that you've got some runs on the board. That's not necessary. Shouldn't be necessary anyway, but in the event that that's the only option, then sometimes that does happen with personal assets. So if you are expanding and you're doing really well, this could be an opportune time to review what you've got already and see if you can improve it by separating personal assets from your practice as well, which will make things much cleaner if you are looking to have other consultants buy into your practice as well. You don't want your home securing their risk, if that makes sense. Obviously, anytime you look to a review, we try and get you better rates, better terms, help with the cash flow. Could be re-extending the loan term back out as well, just to improve your cash flow. Probably didn't matter as much a couple of years ago, but with the rates where they are, that is a very frequent discussion that I do have. And it could also just be through the review of your lending that you can access some capital, just have some cash there. So if you are looking to do things longer term, but you're not 100% sure when, you've got the funds there. And that just gives you a lot of flexibility. I always refer to the sleep at night test too. If you're looking to take on some extra risk, if you've got the money there, that if something doesn't go to plan, you're okay. So goodwill lending. So this could be if you're buying into a practice or if you're actually planning to sell part of your practice to someone else. It's always good to know. And some lenders will actually lend against your personal goodwill if you are looking to expand as well. Dave, I won't be much longer. But goodwill lending, you can lend between 10, 15 years. It's no security apart from like personal guarantees or a GSA, but there's no property that needs to be offered as security. And depending on the lender, they may want a lot of information around what it's for and it's specific to that purpose, but other ones may actually just be happy to lend against the goodwill that you've built up, and then you can use it for investment purposes. So that is where knowing what's available in the market does become crucial, because it could be make or break as to whether or not you could do it. So support network, as tonight might have indicated, there's a lot of niche areas in growing your practice and running a successful practice. So you shouldn't have to know everything about everything. It's having the people around you that can give you the guidance. So that is the property buyer's advocate or property advisor or legal advisor in terms of if you are looking at a property to lease or purchase, whether it's fit for purpose, your accountant. I've seen so many examples of tax debts and things where clients have actually decided to do their own taxes and their own bookkeeping, and it's just been not great as an outcome, and it does impact their ability to borrow funds because banks don't like tax debts. But they can also help you plan and structure so that you are getting the best possible outcome for the investment that you're putting in. Financial advisor to plan for retirement. That could be, around whether or not you purchase in a super fund or whether you purchase in a different entity. Like, these are key questions that they'll ask and hopefully work with you to get an answer. The finance broking side of things, as I can tell you, any lender you go to will give you a different answer on a different scenario. So what's good for you today may not be good for you in 10 years. And the same goes, what was good for you 10 years ago may not be good for today. Lawyer, I think they've sold themselves today, so we're all good. And practice management, so that's where APS has demonstrated their ability to assist, especially if you are starting out and you're not really in a position to put that capital investment in or justify the investment of actually hiring direct staff in that case, and probably do with some extra guidance. But that's me in a nutshell. Hopefully
Thanks so much, Kate. I love hearing you talk, and there's so much to cover around. So we're going to sign off now. We've covered so much, and there will be wait for the next slide, because there is a special QR code you can log into to find out more about the different speakers and services that we have here, and through that process register to win a prize. What we've done with this webinar series and what you've seen tonight is that Avant, while it started up 130 years ago as a group of doctors trying to indemnify themselves and insure against malpractice claims, actually Avant now is a much bigger organisation, and we've diversified into including supporting the business of running your private practice. So through Avant Financial Services, Avant Law and Avant Practice Solutions, we have many ways that we can we can work through and support you. Feel free to scan the QR code, which we're going to bring up, Menos, on the next slide, to enter, and through that you're able to send out interest in speaking to the lawyers, speaking to the finance team, or speaking to the practice management consultants, bookkeepers and virtual receptionists in Practice Solutions. Now, these services are available to all doctors. You don't have to be Avant members, but of course, being an Avant member brings you many benefits. If you have a look inside the webinar chat, you will see some links for the booking the meeting, as well as some other resources related to this. So on behalf of all the speakers, I'd like to thank you for coming to this chat. I hope that you've found it helpful. We've covered a lot of ground, and you'll get a follow-up email from this, which will include a link to the recording of this so you can go through the material. And I know for a fact that all of us are very happy to take questions and contacts. So please reach out and we'd be happy to help you achieve your goal of getting to your best practice ever and cover the gap between where you are now and where you're going to. So on that note, thanks very much and good night.